November 14th, 2019, 6:09 a.m. local time in London. A Boeing 787-9 takes off heading east and begins to fly over Holland, Germany, Poland, Belarus, goes into Russia, Kazakhstan, crosses China, Philippines and Indonesia, for then start to fly over Australia and to arrive 19 hours and 90 minutes later to Sydney. First flight in history without stopovers, connecting these two sister cities in culture but separated by 17,000 kilometers. To understand routes like this one, we must first go back a few years and understand what did not allow such long roads in the past. It all goes back to 1914, when the first flight of an airline was made, which traveled approximately 30 kilometers in Tampa, Florida. For the time, something unimaginable, similar to what would be today the first tourist trip to the moon. Unfortunately, just at that time was starting the First World War, and all countries realized that aircraft were perfect tools for war, making possible the scanning of the battlefield from above, a completely new perspective, and even being able to attack the enemy from the air. And for that reason, in the period of the First World War, aircraft saw a tremendous technological development, improving the performance and especially the power of their engines. Once the First World War was ended in 1918, aviation had taken a big technological leap, so they could begin to be used transporting goods and important cargo and later on passengers. Not only because the capacity of all aircraft increased, but also because they were safer and more efficient than a few years ago. Aircraft were able to perform the transport task quickly. This drew attention to the transport of mail that previously was carried by land, taking a long time and achieving very slow communications. Aviation managed to improve this sector. That is why all airlines that began to fly at the end of the First World War did so, carrying mail. For example, a few years later, Iberia was founded in 1927, which began operating 3 Rohrbatch Roland aircraft, connecting the cities of Madrid and Barcelona. The aircraft had a maximum speed of about 200 km per hour and a flight time up to 5 hours maximum, so it could not have gone much farther than Barcelona anyway. That's because during this period, aircraft used the only engines that exist at that time, the piston engines, which were little developed in aviation. However, while airlines operated this type of aircraft, in parallel were being fulfilled milestones that allow society to evolve to what we know today as aviation. We will talk in detail in another video about the many important milestones, but let me mention one of the most important, the flight performed by Charles Lindbergh in 1927. This incredible pilot managed to the first time in history to cross the Atlantic flying solo, without fuel stops, and from New York to Paris, in no more and no less than 33 hours and 30 minutes, approximately 6,000 kilometers of travel. The aircraft was called Spirit of St. Louis and was designed for only one crew member. It was small, with a wingspan of about 14 meters. It had a piston engine in radial configuration that gave only about 220 horsepower, and maximum speed was about 200 kilometers per hour, so you can understand why it took 33 hours. On the subject of fuel, here is where is the most interesting thing. The aircraft could not land to refuel or do it in mid-air, so the plane was loaded with a lot of fuel, to such an extent that brakes, radios and other non-essential systems were removed completely to save weight for fuel. Even the front window area was replaced by an additional tank, which completely removed the pilot's forward vision. In case you've lost the context, we're talking about crossing the Atlantic Ocean in 1927 with a single engine plane without the ability of land for refueling or emergencies and without even being able to see ahead when flying, having to rely 100% on flight instruments. Yes, an incredible achievement. This showed society the true potential of airplanes, and for that reason the airlines had a real boom between both world wars. And then years later, in the Second World War, the first jet planes were developed, and that changed everything. But despite that, this new type of aircraft were not included into commercial aviation until years later, so the airlines at the end of the war initially operated with conventional piston aircraft developed for transporting goods and troops during the war. These engines had one failure every 4,000 flight hours, so a failure in both engines occurred every 8 million flight hours. Therefore, an island with 200 aircraft, each operating 2,500 hours per year, could expect a double failure in engines every 16 years. For this reason, the FAA in 1953 created the regulation on twin-engine aircraft, not to go more than 60 minutes away from the nearest airport, because in case of failure of one engine, you would have to go immediately to an airport because the probability of failure of the other one was also high. Relatively high, of course. This forced airlines to use on their long routes aircraft with more than 2 engines. This could be safer just by simpler redundancy of engines. The introduction of jet engine, and especially the Boeing 707 in 1955, meant that by 1970 more people were crossing the Atlantic by plane than by sea. And this new technology was much safer for several reasons, but mainly because the turbine engine is much more reliable and fails less than the piston engine. Also, these planes managed to fly higher in cruise, so they could easily fly over storms that conventional aircraft cannot avoid. And here is where a key concept is introduced. Without it, current commercial air routes could not be understood. The concept is ETOPS, and it is nothing more than a set of rules designed to increase the safety of twin-engine aircraft when they travel transoceanic routes, ensuring that if the plane has a failure in the middle of the ocean, it will be able to divert to the nearest airport. The obvious but not so obvious thing here is that the FAA rule that prohibits flying more than 60 minutes away from an airport, when we talk about populated and developed areas, is not a problem because everywhere you fly to, there is an airport there. But when we talk about crossing the ocean, things get complicated. Well, the first transoceanic flight with twin-engine planes were through the north of the Atlantic, flying over all the islands, and as you can imagine, this route is much longer. However, look at today's flights. For example, do you think these planes are less than 1 hour from any airport? No, of course they're not. That is because ETOPS certification allows a plane to fly more than 60 minutes away from the nearest airport. In 1985, a Transworld Airlines Boeing 767 crossed the Atlantic from New York to London. On this route, it passed south of Greenland and then descended towards Ireland. Upon arrival, the air traffic controllers communicating saying, "You're lucky, you made it. Are both engines working?" This flight was the first commercial flight under ETOPS regulations. It was allowed to fly 75 minutes away from an alternative airport. But of course, for this Boeing 767 to qualify as ETOPS, the airline had to implement certain modifications and improvements to the plane, and this just to add an extra 15 minutes away from an airport. 18 years later, in 2003, a United Boeing 777 flying from New Zealand to Los Angeles had an engine failure in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and ended up landing safely in Hawaii after flying for several hours with only one engine working. Here, the second ETOPS objective was demonstrated: protection. This aircraft, the Boeing 777, like most modern long-haul aircraft, has been designed from scratch as an ETOPS aircraft. It has the necessary redundancies to ensure that no systems can critically fail, not even when losing an engine. Depending on how safe an aircraft is, it can be guaranteed ETOPS 75 minutes, 90, 120, 180, or the maximum that has been granted ETOPS 370 minutes. The possibility of granting ETOPS to an aircraft has generated a great economic impact, opening new routes and making them more efficient. It has also lowered the cost of flight since it has managed to lower the number of engines needed in long-haul routes. I remind you that this rule only applies to two-engine aircraft and therefore has lowered overall consumption. Before ETOPS, to cross the ocean, the industry in general had to design planes with more than two engines. That's the reason for planes like the Boeing 707, Boeing 747, A340 or the DC-10. Today, in 2021, we have twin-engine aircraft such as the A350 extra wide body, which offers 370 minutes of ETOPS flight time. That allows him to make flights almost around the entire planet, regardless of whether or not there are alternative airports. In these examples, we can see how 60-minute ETOPS would force the aircraft to cross the Atlantic avoiding these areas. ETOPS 75 allows you to fly over more ocean and avoid going so far up, while ETOPS 180 allows you to get into almost any part of the North Atlantic. Aircraft more than than 30 years old, such as the Boeing 777 or the A330, already have this last certification of at least 180 minutes. However, there is an important point to note. When the Air 380 flew for the first time in 2005, the factor of using 4 engines had nothing to do with ETOPS. It was more related to being able to carry so many passengers, up to 800 in its most economical version. So this decision to design the aircraft with 4 engines by Airbus was purely economic after analyzing the market. But aircraft like the DC-10 or MD-11 that have more than 40 years of age use 3 engines to carry out ocean routes. Something to clarify in case anyone wonders, when you see on the map the shape of aircraft routes, it may seem strange the path that it takes. Why not draw the straight line? Well, because the Earth is really spherical, regardless some stupid people opinion, and when looking at a map, it seems that the shortest distance would be the straight, but as the Earth geoid has more volume at the equator, all routes will try to move away from this area in order to be shorter. Nowadays, technology is so advanced that airlines are looking to operate planes with only 2 engines, because the more engines, the more maintenance cost and more fuel cost. For example, the fuel consumption of an A340 is 3.49 liters per 100 kilometers per seat, while an A350 is 2.39 liters. Imagine what this translates into. Cheaper tickets for passengers and higher profits for the company. So as you can see, the type of route today is no longer determined by technological issues but by economical and profitability for the airline. This has been confirmed over the last decade, where ultra long-haul trips have become more and more common. In 2001, Continental Airlines launched the longest road operational in history to the date, departing from New York with a Boeing 777 and heading north through Canada, the North Pole, Russia, Mongolia, and China, and then to Hong Kong. A 16-hour journey covering a distance of 13,500 kilometers. In 2004, Singapore Airlines introduced Singapore-Los Angeles. Later in October the same year, Singapore Airlines introduced Singapore-New York, the longest route to the date, 15,350 kilometers and 18 hours and 40 minutes. However, around the year 2008, due to the economical crisis, oil prices went up, and this forced airlines to cancel ultra-long-haul routes, such as these ones, from Singapore to New York and Los Angeles. You have to understand that such long routes are an economical challenge for airlines, and they are totally dependent on external factors such as oil prices. This meant that both Airbus and Boeing were required to be extremely efficient in their new A350 and Boeing 787 models, which meant that when oil prices settled down again, new routes could be opened with the new models. For example, flights opened from Delhi to San Francisco, Dubai, Auckland, Doha, Auckland, and in 2018, Qantas launched its new Perth to London route, 17.5 hours of flying, giving the possibility to connect Australia and the UK non-stop, taking into account the cultural roots they have in common. A few months ago, in early October 2021, a repatriate flight was made from Buenos Aires to Perth, crossing the Antarctica in a flight of 17 hours and a half. And here's where the record comes. Qantas in 2019 made the test flight with a Boeing 787 from Sydney to London non-stop, covering more than 17,000 kilometers and lasting 19 hours and 20 minutes. However, after analyzing it, Qantas have said that this route could be rather performed with the long-haul A350 models if Airbus could add extra fuel tanks. They are still in negotiations and Airbus is in the development process, although apparently the pandemic has left this project on standby. For those of you who think that these kind of routes are not going to be successful because of their long duration, remember what we told you. The limit nowadays is purely economical, so an airline is never going to operate a route that is going to make a loss. For example, it is more profitable for an airline to make a route Madrid to Hanoi, making a stopover in Dubai, than to make a direct flight. This may seem counterintuitive because the planes, when they consume the most, is a takeoff and climb, and with a stopover you will have 2 takeoffs. However, when the route is so long, you have to carry a lot of fuel, which makes the weight very high, and you have to put more fuel to carry the fuel needed, and to put that fuel you are adding more weight, and so need more fuel, and so on and so forth. This is represented in this graph of consumption with respect of the distance of the route. This point is the distance at which the aircraft will spend less fuel. In particular, this is the 777-200, so its optimal distance is about 4,300 kilometers. As an airline, you have to study that the route you want to do is not far to the right on this graph, because the fuel cost skyrockets. For this reason, for example, tourist flights to far destinations end up having stopovers, because tourists prefer to pay a little less and make a stopover than to pay more and go direct. And the same happens with cargo planes. Almost always when traveling to far destinations, they make stopovers. However, for the business flight, airlines can afford to make them direct and to continue in profits. They simply raise the ticket prices as businessmen prefer to go direct and pay more. As you can see, today we can go practically anywhere on the globe regardless of where you take off from. But let me open a question in the comments. When do you think the first flight around the world non-stop, for example from New York to New York, will be made? Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you want, you could subscribe to not miss new videos. And remember to think supersonic.